Hi, I'm Robin Murray. I'm a professor at the Institute of Psychiatry in London, and I'm really a schizophrenia researcher. I study schizophrenia, and it was really by accident we found that increasing numbers of our patients with schizophrenia were indeed cannabis users and indeed dependent on cannabis. So today I'm going to talk about the impact of cannabis use on the characteristics and incidence of psychosis. And this shows the percentages of the constituents of cannabis, THC and CBD in cannabis samples seized by the American authorities from 1995 to 2019. And in the red line, you can see that the percentage of THC goes up from about 3%, 4% in 1995 to about 15, 14, 50% in 2019. And at the same time, the concentration of CBD, if anything, decreases. So cannabis is much more potent in the USA than it has been in the past, and the data from Europe are similar. The first study to look at the relationship between cannabis and psychosis was actually over 100 years ago in 1894. And then the British authorities in India, the colonial authorities, were concerned about the number of people being admitted to psychiatric hospitals. They had built lots of asylums, and they found that quite a large proportion of the people who were being admitted were cannabis users. And so they had this big investigation over 18 months to examine this question. And for example, here is an example of what they said. The majority of habitual consumers become permanently insane, never to be cured. Some become temporarily so and become sane on breaking off the habit, but the symptoms are apt to be reinduced on resuming the habit. So this was known over 100 years ago, but unfortunately we forgot this. And it was in 1987 that Andreasson and his colleagues produced these data from Sweden. And this slide shows that the cases of schizophrenia per 100,000 on the vertical axis and the number of times cannabis taken by age 18 on the horizontal axis. And this was 50,000 young men conscripted into the Swedish army, followed up for 15 years. And you can see that those who'd hardly ever taken cannabis or just once or twice had a low likelihood of schizophrenia, and those who'd taken cannabis more than 50 times had a high risk of schizophrenia. This is a difficult study to replicate, and it wasn't replicated until 2002. And then a whole lot of studies came out replicating it. And these are shown, or at least some of these are shown in this new part of the slide. And the more important part to see is the part in blue on the right-hand column. And this is the odds ratio of becoming psychotic or having psychotic symptoms if you're a cannabis user versus not being a cannabis user. So these are all prospective studies following up samples of the general population and showing that if you use cannabis, you're more likely to become psychotic. We did a study in New Zealand where we examined the risk of schizophreniform psychosis at age 26 if you had started using cannabis at 18, and the risk was increased a bit, 1.6, but that was not significant. If you started by 15 or less, the risk shot up. So the odds ratio was 4.5. So starting young increases the risk. And here we show a whole series of slides. This is a meta-analysis by Adriana Marconi, and she showed that each of these lines is a study. And on the left-hand side are those people who hardly ever use cannabis, and on the right are those people who use the top 20% cannabis users. And you can see in every study, the people on the right have a higher risk of psychosis. But at the bottom, the risk is not much increased. And that's because this is a study of Tien in 1990 in America, when cannabis was still quite dilute. But the red line here is London in 2010. And by then you can see that cannabis is much more concentrated and the odds ratio is much higher. It was nearly 8. So overall, the odds ratio for heavy use of cannabis for developing psychosis is 3.9 or roughly 4. Here we've taken 121 schizotypal normal volunteers. So people who had filled in a schizotypal questionnaire and were on the high side, and we randomized them either to giving THC or placebo. So we took schizotypal people as we thought they would be more susceptible. And we put them in a virtual reality scenario where they had the experience of going into the underground, the subway, the tube in London. And when they went into the carriage, they would see avatars that looked a bit like people, and they would say what they would do a rating scale. And ordinary people vary very much in what they say. For example, one lady, when she came in, she said, "Oh, this man looked at me. He smiled at me. He seemed very interested in me. I think he must have fancied me. He must have thought I was attractive." And another young lady, when she had the experience of going into the tube, she saw this man and she said, "Oh, he looked at me, but he looked very hostile. I don't think he liked me." And so when we compared the paranoia score in the people who had this experience after a placebo, the mean score was 6.8, but after THC, it was 15.6. So if you give high enough doses of THC, then people can become paranoid. Here's another evidence of that. Here we're giving a THC intravenously, and in the blue, they just have THC and a placebo, and they have the the placebo here, they have the THC here, and you can see up goes the paranoia score. But in the second group, we give them CBD orally, a large dose of CBD, 600 or 800 milligrams, and the extent of the paranoia decreases. So large doses of CBD decrease the paranoia inducing effect of THC. However, when we have tried doing this in doses equivalent of the CBD that you would get in a joint that you would smoke, a spliff or a joint, the CBD doesn't seem to have much effect. So although initially we were hopeful that the CBD in a joint would prevent the psychotic effects, you would have to give far too much CBD. England has been unusual in that the consumption of cannabis has been falling. This is the percentage of people using cannabis in England. And you can see along the bottom is the whole population, adult population. But up here you can see 16 to 24-year-olds, and you can see that cannabis consumption steadily fell, very unusual. But then from about 2013-14, it stabilized and then began to creep back up. I think this is the influence of all the cannabis propaganda coming from the USA. So we know that cannabis can induce psychosis. What kind of psychosis is it? Well, it has an earlier onset, on average about 6 years earlier than the average age of onset of psychosis in England is about 28, 29. But cannabis-induced psychosis is about 6 years earlier. It's particularly associated with positive symptoms, especially paranoid delusions. It is associated strangely with a higher premorbid IQ and better premorbid function. So as you know, many people who go psychotic are neurodevelopmentally impaired. So they are, as children, they're not quite as clever or sociable or function quite so well as their brothers and sisters. But the cannabis-induced psychotic patients are quite different. They're very successful academically, they're very sociable, so they have lots of friends, and their friends introduce them to cannabis when they're 12 or 13 or 14. So they look different premorbidly. They have a worse outcome. This is a meta-analysis by Tabia Schuler, showing that continued cannabis use is associated with higher relapse rates, longer hospital admissions, and more severe psychotic symptoms. Now, in the UK, we think of 15 or 16% THC as being high potency. But in Holland and in the USA, you can get much higher proportions of THC. So this is from Colorado. You can get, say, cannabis oil with about, say, 40, 50% THC. You can get a honeycomb with about 60%, shatter with 80%. And you can now actually get some crystal cannabis, which is over 90% THC. So it's becoming a different, a very different substance. The final point I want to talk about is, does cannabis use, is it sufficiently important to impact on the incidence of psychosis? And this is a study carried out across Europe with 5 centers in Spain. And in each country, we had at least 1 or 2 large cities, and then smaller, more rural areas. So for in London, in UK, we had London, a big city, and Cambridge, which is a small city. And this is the incidence of psychosis across Europe. And you can see that the highest incidence is in London and Amsterdam and in Paris. The incidence is lower in Spain. Even in Madrid and Barcelona, it's lower than these other centers. And it's similar to the incidence in Italy, which is also low. So the big northern cities have the high incidence. And one of the main reasons for that is high potency cannabis. So again, this is Dr. DeForti, who will be speaking to you later. This is people who have never used cannabis, rarely, and here is daily of low potency, and here is daily of high potency, odds ratio 5. Here is Amsterdam, again, low potency, rarely, up to low potency daily, not very different to low potency in London, but the high potency carries a higher risk because there is much more really high potency cannabis in Holland. Our definition of high potency was 10%. So the average THC content in London was about 16%, but in Holland it went up to 60%. So that carries a greater risk. We found that there was a relationship between the frequency of cannabis use and the rate of psychosis, the incidence. So in the gray is the incidence of psychosis, again, starting with London on the left, and London, Amsterdam, and Paris having the high incidence. and rural areas like Cambridge, and then Spain and Italy having low rates. And you can see that the prevalence of cannabis use tended to follow that for the incidence. The correlation was 0.8. So I think we can say that the incidence of psychosis across Europe varies very much depending on the use of cannabis and the frequency with which people use high potency cannabis. And London was one of the places with the highest incidence, but we wondered whether the incidence of psychosis has always been high in London. And this is data by Jane Boydell and also by Diego Patroni. And you can see here, this study goes back to 1965, and we have been collecting data on the incidence of schizophrenia according to the research diagnostic criteria since 1965. And you can see the incidence in blue. So obviously the incidence of schizophrenia is lower than that of psychosis as a whole. But in the 1960s, the incidence was about 11 per 100,000, going up to 14 or 15, going up in the 1980s to to about 20%, and then finally increasing, to 20 per 100,000 and to about 35 per 100,000. So a 3.5-fold increase in the incidence. And one of the major reasons for that was the increase in the use of cannabis. This is the proportion of patients known to be abusing cannabis. In the 1960s, relatively few people with schizophrenia were abusing cannabis, but you can see it steadily climbed till by 2011-12, more than 50% were abusing cannabis. So it's a correlation, but it is very suggestive that the more cannabis is smoked, the greater the incidence of schizophrenia. And there's other evidence for that. The incidence of cannabis-induced psychosis more than doubled in Denmark between 2006 and 2016. Rates of inpatient hospitalizations with cannabis-induced psychosis in Canada tripled from 2006 to 2015. Cannabis was decriminalized in Portugal in 2001. And from 2002 until 2015, the proportion of psychosis patients diagnosed as cannabis dependent rose from less than 1% to over 10%. So that just indicates that, well, of course, cannabis is becoming more potent over this time, but also it was becoming more freely available in Portugal, and the incidence was going up. So let me conclude. Cannabis use is a component cause of psychosis. Heavy cannabis use has a significant impact on the incidence of psychosis. We need public campaigns to advise people of the risks of daily use of high potency cannabis. And there is this big question: will legalization and commercialization of cannabis use lead to a worldwide increase in the incidence and prevalence of psychosis? I'm not so worried about the legalization, but I'm very worried about the commercialization. The big tobacco companies and alcohol companies are buying up North American cannabis companies because particularly the cigarette companies, people are not smoking so much tobacco, so they need to keep their factories busy. So their ambition is to sell as much cannabis as they have been selling tobacco. And if we allow that to happen, then I think we will see an increase in the incidence and prevalence of psychosis. Thank you very much for listening.